Picture a Ford showroom in the fall of 1964. A young executive walks in wanting something fast, stylish, and cheap enough to actually afford, and he walks straight past a 2-ton personal luxury coupe with a nearly $4,000 price tag to put a deposit on a brand new Mustang instead. In the space of about 6 months, Ford's own scrappy little pony car had done something nobody at the company fully saw coming. It had started eating the sales of Ford's flagship personal car, the Thunderbird, a model that had practically invented the idea of a luxury coupe for one important person and maybe a passenger or two. Thunderbird sales for 1965 would drop by roughly 18,000 units compared to the year before, and more than a few people inside Ford's own walls were quietly asking whether the car that started an entire segment of the American auto industry was about to be crushed by its own little brother. This is the story of how the 1965 Ford Thunderbird, sitting right in the crosshairs of an identity crisis triggered by Ford's own cheaper, faster Mustang, doubled down on being something the Mustang could never be. And in doing so didn't just survive. It cemented a market category that would define an entire era of American automobiles: the personal luxury car. To understand why 1965 mattered so much, you have to go back a full decade to a Ford design studio in the early 1950s, where a group of engineers and stylists were staring nervously at Chevrolet's brand new Corvette. General Motors had unveiled the Corvette prototype, and Ford's leadership panicked, worried that Chevrolet was about to own the entire American sports car conversation. Ford's response: greenlit under former General Motors executive Louis Crusoe and developed at a pace that still looks fast by modern standards, went from an approved idea to a running prototype in about a year. But here's the crucial decision that separated the Thunderbird from the very beginning, the decision that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. Ford's engineers looked at the Corvette's fiberglass body, its stripped-down interior, its focus on handling over comfort, and they deliberately built something different. They called the Thunderbird a personal car, not a sports car. And that distinction wasn't just marketing spin. It shaped every single engineering decision that followed. Where the Corvette prioritized cornering, the Thunderbird prioritized comfort. Where the Corvette gave you a manual choke and vinyl seats, the Thunderbird gave you power windows, a radio that automatically raised its volume as the engine got louder so you could still hear it over wind noise, and something called dial-o-matic power seats that could remember where you liked to sit. When the Thunderbird launched for 1955, it outsold the Corvette by an embarrassing margin, over 16,000 units to Chevrolet's roughly 700. And that gap alone should have told the entire American auto industry something important about what buyers actually wanted. They didn't necessarily want to feel like a race car driver. They wanted to feel important. But even that wasn't the moment the Thunderbird truly became legendary. Because the two-seat original, as beloved as it is today among collectors, was still fundamentally a niche product, a stylish toy for a buyer with no kids and no need to carry anyone else. The real turning point, the decision that actually created an entirely new category of automobile, happened in 1958, when Ford's designers did something that should have been commercially suicidal. They took the Thunderbird, a car whose entire identity was built around being an exclusive two-seater, and they added a back seat. Purists at the time were furious. Adding 2 more seats and stretching the car meant sacrificing that lean, personal, almost jealous exclusivity that had made the original Thunderbird special in the first place. It was the kind of decision that on paper looks like a company diluting its own product to chase more sales. The exact kind of move that usually backfires and alienates the loyal customers who made a car special to begin with. Instead, the opposite happened. Sales jumped by 50%. Ford had accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, discovered that what people actually wanted wasn't a two-seat sports car pretending to be exclusive. They wanted a car that looked and felt like a status symbol, that drove like a living room on wheels, but that could still fit a spouse and a couple of kids for a Sunday drive. That 1958 four-seat Thunderbird is now widely credited by automotive historians as the true birth of the personal luxury car segment, a category built on the specific formula of a close-coupled four-seat coupe wrapped around a powerful engine, prioritizing comfort and image over any pretense of being a sports car. And once that formula proved itself in the sales numbers, everyone in Detroit took notice. By the early 1960s, the Thunderbird wasn't just successful, it was practically printing money for Ford, and it had inspired direct copycats determined to grab a piece of that same market. Studebaker, a company that was hemorrhaging money and desperately needed a hit, launched the Avanti, a fiberglass-bodied four-seat coupe marketed explicitly as a high-performance personal car, chasing the exact audience the Thunderbird had created. General Motors, never willing to let a profitable segment go uncontested, greenlit an internal design competition, and Buick emerged as the winner with the Riviera, a car that started life, almost unbelievably, as a Cadillac concept that Cadillac's own management didn't want. These weren't small, half-hearted efforts either. The Riviera alone would move over 112,000 units across its first 3 model years. A clear signal that the entire American auto industry now understood personal luxury cars weren't a fad, they were a legitimate, lucrative category. And the Thunderbird had invented it almost by accident. So by 1964, when Ford introduced the 4th-generation Thunderbird, the car everyone in showrooms would actually recognize as the classic mid-60s T-Bird, the stakes were enormous. This wasn't just another model refresh. This was Ford defending a market it had personally created, against General Motors divisions now actively gunning for the same buyers with genuinely excellent competition from Buick, and soon from Oldsmobile, with its wildly innovative front-wheel drive Toronado. Ford's designers doubled down on what had worked in 1958, but pushed it further toward pure formality and presence. They gave this generation a squared-off, almost architectural look, replacing the softer jet-age curves of earlier Thunderbirds with crisp, confident lines that looked less like a hot rod and more like a private jet's cabin turned into a car body. Under the hood sat a standard 390 cubic inch V8 producing 300 horsepower. And here's a detail that tells you everything about what this car was actually built to do. That big, heavy engine needed almost 11 full seconds to get the Thunderbird from 0 to 60 miles an hour. 11 seconds in a car with a genuine 390 cubic inch V8, at a time when plenty of far smaller and cheaper cars could beat that number without breaking a sweat. Contemporary automotive journalists were blunt about it. Testers openly stated that rivals like the Buick Riviera, the Pontiac Grand Prix, and the Chrysler 300 were simply more capable, more roadworthy machines in almost every measurable performance category. The suspension was tuned soft enough that the Thunderbird would lean, wallow, and float its way through corners in a way that would have embarrassed a genuine sports car. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. None of that mattered. The Thunderbird kept its commanding lead in the personal luxury segment anyway, because acceleration numbers and cornering grip were never actually the point. Buyers weren't cross-shopping a Thunderbird against a Corvette. They were cross-shopping it against how they wanted the neighbors to see them pull into the driveway. Then 1965 arrived, and with it came the moment this story really turns on. The moment the Thunderbird's entire strategic identity got tested by a threat coming from inside its own company. Ford's Mustang had launched in the spring of 1964 to an explosive, almost unprecedented public reaction, moving units at a pace that stunned even Ford's own sales projections. And the Mustang offered something the Thunderbird simply couldn't compete with on paper: genuine sporty styling, 2 doors, comfortable seating for 4, all wrapped in a price tag that undercut the Thunderbird by a massive margin. For a young buyer trying to decide between looking sporty and stylish on a budget versus looking sporty and stylish while going seriously into debt, the math wasn't complicated. Thunderbird's sales for the 1965 model year slid to just under 75,000 units, down significantly from the year before, and a meaningful chunk of that decline got attributed directly to Ford cannibalizing its own flagship with its own new hit. Picture the position Ford's product planners found themselves in. Their 2 biggest success stories of the decade were now actively competing for the same customer's wallet, and one of them was priced so aggressively it threatened to make the other one look like an overpriced relic. Ford's answer to this threat is the part of the story that deserves far more credit than it usually gets, because instead of panicking and trying to make the Thunderbird cheaper or sportier to compete head-on with the Mustang, Ford's leadership made the opposite bet. They leaned harder into everything that made the Thunderbird different, betting that the 2 cars weren't actually fighting over the same customer at all. They just looked like they were on the surface. The 1965 Thunderbird got a round of engineering upgrades that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with refinement and presence. Front disc brakes became standard equipment for the first time, nearly doubling the car's previously mediocre stopping power. A genuinely important safety and comfort upgrade for a 2-ton car that heavier, faster stopping competitors like the Riviera had already been offering. And Ford finally delivered a feature that had actually been intended for the car a year earlier, but got held up by state vehicle lighting regulations: the sequential rear turn signals, where each segment of the broad horizontal taillight would flash in sequence from the inside out every time you signaled a turn. It sounds like a small, almost frivolous detail today, but at the time it became one of the most talked about features in the entire American auto industry. Instantly recognizable, copied by other Ford products, and later even licensed onto the Shelby Mustang and the Mercury Cougar. It was pure theater, a completely unnecessary flourish that did nothing for performance, and everything for making the person behind the wheel feel like they were driving something special every single time they signaled a lane change. This is the part where you need to stop and really sit with the strategy Ford was running here, because it's easy to look back at 11-second 0 to 60 times and squishy handling and assume Ford's engineers just weren't very good at their jobs. That's completely backwards. Ford's engineers were extremely good at their jobs. They were just optimizing for a completely different scorecard than the one enthusiasts usually judge classic cars by today. Every single decision on the 1965 Thunderbird, the soft suspension tuning, the hushed cabin, the elaborate power seats, the swing-away steering column that moved 10 inches to the right to make getting in and out easier for someone dressed in their Sunday best. All of it was in service of one specific emotional target. The Thunderbird needed to make an ordinary commute feel like an occasion. One contemporary road tester in 1965 put it about as bluntly as automotive journalism ever gets, writing that the car offered more symbolism than stature, and that only the blessedly ignorant would view it as anything more than a luxury class car for people who wanted to project a certain kind of image. That quote was almost certainly meant as a backhanded criticism, and yet it accidentally captured exactly why the Thunderbird was succeeding. Ford wasn't selling transportation. Ford was selling symbolism, deliberately, expertly, at a scale no other American manufacturer had quite figured out how to replicate yet. The market kept validating that bet in ways that must have been deeply satisfying for whoever inside Ford had championed this direction against the obvious temptation to chase the Mustang's formula instead. Even with the Mustang stealing headlines and younger buyers, even against increasingly serious competition from Oldsmobile's genuinely groundbreaking front-wheel drive Toronado and Buick's continually refined Riviera, Thunderbird sales for 1966 climbed back up towards 70,000 units, holding the pace as the car to beat in the entire personal luxury segment. Ford had correctly read something that a lot of manufacturers get wrong when a cheaper internal competitor starts eating into a flagship's numbers. Not every customer who couldn't afford, or didn't want, a Thunderbird was actually a lost Thunderbird sale. A huge portion of the Mustang's buyers were an entirely different customer, often younger, often more budget-conscious, often specifically drawn to the idea of an affordable sports coupe rather than a stately luxury cruiser. The Thunderbird's actual core buyer, the person who wanted to arrive somewhere and have that arrival mean something, was largely unmoved by the Mustang's existence. Ford had two genuinely different products serving two genuinely different emotional needs. And 1965 was the year that became undeniably clear, both in the sales figures and in how confidently Ford's designers refused to chase the Mustang's playbook. Here's where the deeper engineering and design philosophy really comes into focus, because the personal luxury car formula that the Thunderbird had now fully perfected by 1965 wasn't actually about any single feature. It was about a specific, repeatable combination of choices that other manufacturers would spend the next 2 decades trying to copy. Take a midsize or full-size platform. Keep it a close-coupled 2-door instead of a practical 4-door sedan. Wrap it in styling that signals status through sheer visual weight and detail rather than aggression. Pack the interior with comfort and convenience technology that feels almost decadent, and tune the entire chassis for isolation and smoothness rather than outright capability. Every single personal luxury car that followed through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Chrysler Cordoba with its famous rich Corinthian leather, the Mercury Cougar in its various luxury-leaning trims, the continually growing Cadillac Eldorado, the Pontiac Grand Prix, all of them were essentially working from a blueprint the Thunderbird had drawn up and then refined into near perfection by 1965. Even Cadillac itself, according to industry historians, didn't formally enter this specific personal luxury category with a dedicated smaller high-volume model until 1967, meaning America's premier luxury brand was still playing catch-up to a strategy Ford had been running successfully for nearly a decade. And this is genuinely remarkable when you think about what could have happened instead. Imagine an alternate version of 1965, where Ford's product planners panicked at the sight of Mustang sales cannibalizing the Thunderbird, and decided the answer was to make the Thunderbird sportier, lighter, faster, more of a direct competitor to its own cheaper sibling. That car probably would have failed on two fronts simultaneously. It would have been too expensive and too heavy to actually compete with the Mustang's performance value proposition, while simultaneously abandoning the exact comfort and status-driven qualities that had made Thunderbird buyers loyal in the first place. Ford would have blurred its own lineup, confused its own customers, and potentially handed the entire personal luxury segment over to Buick and Oldsmobile on a silver platter. Instead, by holding its nerve and doubling down on comfort, presence, and quiet engineering refinement, like those new standard disc brakes and that theatrical sequential taillight, Ford kept the Thunderbird exactly what it needed to be: distinct, aspirational, and untouchable by anything wearing a Mustang badge. The ripple effects of that 1965 decision stretched far beyond just one model year of sales figures, too. The entire personal luxury car category that the Thunderbird had essentially willed into existence back in 1958 and then defended so successfully through the Mustang scare of the mid-1960s went on to become one of the single most profitable segments in the entire American auto industry for the following 2 decades. By the 1970s, personal luxury coupes from Ford, GM, and Chrysler were routinely among the best-selling and highest-margin vehicles each company produced. Entire divisions built substantial portions of their business around chasing the formula the Thunderbird had proven out. Even the Thunderbird nameplate itself kept riding that formula through generation after generation, growing larger and more opulent through the early 1970s before downsizing waves triggered by the 1973 oil crisis eventually reshaped the entire category. From that original two-seat 1955 model through its final discontinuation in 2005, Ford would sell more than 4.4 million Thunderbirds across 11 distinct generations, an extraordinary run for any single nameplate, and one that arguably owes its entire existence to the strategic conviction Ford's team showed in exactly this period, when the easy, panicked move would have been to chase the Mustang, instead of trusting the formula that had already worked. What makes this story worth telling isn't simply that the Thunderbird outsold its rivals in some spreadsheet from 1965. It's the underlying business lesson wrapped inside a car that most people today remember only for its sequential taillights and that oddly specific 11-second 0 to 60 time. A company that has just invented an entire market category faces genuine danger the moment a cheaper, flashier product starts stealing attention, even when that flashier product comes from inside its own walls. The instinct to chase, to compete directly, to water down what made the original special in order to compete on the new product's terms, is powerful and often wrong. Ford's real achievement in 1965 wasn't a horsepower figure or a quarter-mile time. It was the discipline to recognize that the Thunderbird and the Mustang were never actually fighting the same war, and that the smartest response to a threat from your own lineup is sometimes to become more completely, unapologetically yourself. So here's a question worth sitting with. How many companies today, watching a cheaper internal product start stealing their spotlight, would have had the nerve to do what Ford did in 1965 and lean harder into being different instead of racing to compete? Drop a comment if you've ever owned or ridden in one of these classic Thunderbirds, or if you can think of another brand that faced this exact kind of internal identity crisis and either nailed it or completely blew it. And if you want more stories about the strategic gambles hiding behind the most iconic cars in American history, hit subscribe, because there are plenty more of these decisions buried in old boardroom memos and dusty sales reports, just waiting to be dug back up.